Hey everyone, thanks for watching. I'm Chris Hill. Welcome to Fool Global Headquarters in Alexandria, Virginia. I am joined by senior analysts Emily Flippen and Shannon Jones. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
We're going to be talking about certainly one of the biggest trends of, I would say, the last 5 years. You think about marijuana and just how much hype and excitement there is and opportunity for investors. Speaking of which, we've got a free report with 5 marijuana stocks and a lot of what you need to know about the ins and outs of the industry. You can click the link below to get that, or you can go to fool.com/MJ to get that free report. Shannon, let me start with you. Why now? I mean, this has been going on for probably a year or so when you think about how much media coverage marijuana and all of the associated industries have gotten.
Yeah, I think now is a great time for a number of reasons. To your point, last year we saw landmark things happen in the industry. We saw the legalization in Canada for adult use. We're seeing a growing number of states. Now we've got more than 2/3 here in the US that have legalized marijuana in some form. And the great thing is that this industry is still very much young. But what's happening and what we're seeing is this maturity of the industry. So you have now a focus not just on production capacity, but now companies really starting to focus on how do I operate as a business? So they're looking at lowering production costs. How are they diversifying their product portfolio? Or they're going international. So the opportunity to invest, I believe, is here and is now is a great time.
Emily, when you think about all the different ways you can invest, certainly there's a whole industry around medicinal uses. There's the recreational use. When investors are starting to think about this, where should they maybe think about starting first?
Well, I think it's important to take a basket approach. And I know Shannon and I think the reason why we work so well together on the team is because we see the industry differently. I know Shannon focuses a lot more on the medicinal uses. I tend to think the recreational poses the best opportunity for growth, but both are very legitimate investments. And so it's important to take a basket approach because you maybe don't know which companies are going to be the long-term companies that succeed because the industry is so fragmented right now. So buy a handful of companies, both recreational, both medicinal, that you like. Also buy some ancillary companies. So if you like the producers, don't just buy producers. There's opportunities to buy companies that make packaging. There's opportunities to buy companies that have invested heavily into marijuana. So take a basket approach, get a large array of exposure, and that will hedge you against the downside.
And I would even add to that, I think starting small is key because this is very much an industry that is maturing. You know, start with some starter positions. It can be a basket of a handful of stocks. I mean, for some it could be like literally 1% of your portfolio. For others it could be much higher. But I think starting small is key and then continuing to watch. So a lot of these companies have very limited operating histories. So you want to be able to add to those positions over time as you see them start to perform and really mature.
Is that the most common mistake that you've seen among investors who are starting out in marijuana? This idea that they hear one name and it's just in one part of the industry. And the most obvious for people who are just starting out is the producers, as opposed to getting into the more nuanced medical areas of the business. It seems like that's one of, if not the most common mistake people make here.
Absolutely. I think you've got a lot of speculation. You have a lot of investors just chasing headlines. I think anytime you see like a celebrity say that they're starting a marijuana company, immediately investors go and flock. But I will say, I think taking a step back, recognizing that we here at the Motley Fool, we believe in investing in businesses, not chasing tickers, not chasing headlines. So we're looking for long-term opportunities. We want to be able to hold these companies for 3 to 5 years and beyond. And so that means really understanding the fundamentals of the business. You know, what's their path to profitability? What's their strategy? Do they have a unique offering to offer the marketplace? And I think taking a step back, getting away from the hype and really looking at businesses is the best way to do that.
Emily, what do you say to someone who is in the United States, sees the legalization that happened in Canada and says, well, look, yes, there are states here that have various levels of legalization, but we don't have it nationally. Why should I jump into this industry before it is legalized on a national level?
Well, that's a really good question. You don't have to. An investor doesn't have to invest in marijuana before it's legal, whether they want to do it because they're worried about a lot of these companies going under before that happens, whether they're worried just about the ethics of investing in something that may not be federally legal. There's nothing that really says you have to do it now. That being said, I think now is a good time to do it. And it goes back to what we were talking about, why invest in marijuana now? Investors are probably looking at the financial news and they're seeing something like Tilray watch, right? For a long time, it was crypto watch, Bitcoin watch, and we saw what happened to the Bitcoin bubble. And so what's happening is a lot of retail investors are getting pushed into these really hyped, overvalued companies like Tilray, and riding that all the way up and then getting hammered when it gets hit down. So there's an opportunity to invest in companies both in Canada and the US, possibly that have international exposure, but doing them a little bit more under the radar. So not buying the really big names that media tends to send retail investors to, but buying a basket approach of smaller businesses that Shannon said have a good underlying business. You really understand what they're doing in the industry and that you can hold for the long term.
Yeah, and I would even add on the US front, it's not just about, yes, it is illegal on the federal level, but thanks to the 2018 Farm Bill, now hemp-derived CBD, for instance, is now legal. So there are companies that, and I'm sure everybody's heard about the CBD craze, but there are companies that are offering hemp-based CBD products already. And so even though it's illegal, there still is a pathway in which investors can participate in this boom.
I'm glad you mentioned CBD because there are a lot of startup companies in this space. We've also seen some of the biggest, best-known consumer brands on their quarterly conference calls say essentially, yeah, we're absolutely taking a look at this. We're thinking about investing in this space. And I'm thinking primarily of Coca-Cola, Pepsi, a lot of consumer brands. Shannon, I'm assuming we're seeing the same thing when it comes to big healthcare companies as well. Is that maybe a safer way for investors to invest in the marijuana boom?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a way to invest right here and right now, for sure. Safe, I would kind of put a question mark because the jury's still out in terms of just safety of, say, CBD in general. The FDA actually just had a hearing just a few days ago, really digging into, like, we need to see data. We need to actually see what CBD, what the effects are, how does it interact with other medications. So in many ways, it's an opportunity to invest in this space. But in terms of safety, that can be a question mark. I think you're going to see a lot of players entering this space, which means it's just going to get very, very competitive very quickly. So I think really from a CBD aspect, you're going to want to look for companies that have very strong brand strength, have a focus on quality. That's going to be another huge key. I think another differentiator in terms of CBD, and even just marijuana in general, is like onset and offset as well. So like how quickly do people actually feel the effects? I think this is a huge opportunity for not just CBD companies, but for marijuana companies as well.
Last thing before we get to the individual stocks I know you guys are going to talk about. Emily, there are some people, regardless of industry, they look at small companies and part of their thesis for buying it is, I think some bigger company is going to buy them. Is that a reason to invest in marijuana companies, smaller ones? Or do you think, look, you want to focus on the business and if they get bought out, well, then better for you?
I tend to think the latter. I will admit that the former does have some merit, especially when you're looking at a fragmented industry. But when I buy a company, I want to know that I'm holding it because I believe in the underlying business. So we've already seen large acquisitions happen in the marijuana space, and they're happening at huge premiums. And that's wonderful if you're a holder of one of those companies that gets acquired at a premium, but it can be bittersweet, especially if you believe in the underlying business. Sometimes that company that's acquiring it may not have such a great business. So then you're forced with the question of, what do I do with my shares then? Alternatively, we don't know how long people are going to be continued to be bought out at really high premiums. Like I mentioned, companies want to get exposure because they see it as an emerging industry. Once legalization, I do believe it's going to happen in the US sooner rather than later. Once legalization happens in the United States, the question of, okay, does the bubble burst then, right? Is the, kind of growth glory days over, and now we're looking at the core underlying businesses. And you don't want to be holding a company that has a really poor underlying business when that happens, just based off the premise that maybe it'll get bought out. So I tend to be on the side of the latter and think I'd really like to understand my business, have a strong investing thesis before purchasing any company.
All right, we got a lot of questions that are already coming in from folks who are watching. We'll get to those questions in just a second. Shannon, let me start with you. What is one marijuana stock that people should very strongly consider putting on their watch list?
Yeah, one stock I've been talking about, something that Emily and I, a company we've been watching for a while, but continuing on with this CBD theme, and that company is Charlotte's Web. Not the pig, as Chris pointed out to me earlier, not the story.
Beloved children's book.
But no, Charlotte's Web is a company that I think right now probably has the strongest brand recognition across all of the CBD players. They are the #1 company when it comes to CBD. So they manufacture hemp oil, they do capsules, topical products as well. And they're really the huge benefactor of that 2018 Farm Bill. So you actually saw their retail stores go from 3,600 at the end of December. Now they have over 6,000 retail stores where their products are being sold. That's monstrous growth for them. About half of their sales are coming from e-commerce as well, which is huge, especially as we continue to watch margins, which is key for profitability. They're aiming for about 111% growth in sales in 2019, another 120% in 2020. Gross margins north of 70% currently, and they've got a forward PE ratio less than 20, which is almost unheard of at this point. So I think a company like Charlotte's Web, they have tremendous market share right now. I think the question will be, can they hold on to that market share as more players enter the space? I tend to believe that they can, just because they were first out of the gate, and they have a really compelling story. The name behind this company, Charlotte's Web, was about a little girl who had seizures over, I think, 300 a week. It was only once she started taking their product that she started to not only get better, but dramatically improve. So this is a company that I can rally behind, that I think offers a huge benefit to society as well.
All right, Emily, what about you?
This is going to be a little bit of an oddball, I think, for a lot of people listening, but it's actually Constellation Brands. Now, this is the beer, wine, spirits producer here in the U.S. They make Modelo beers, Corona, and a lot of people who maybe aren't familiar with the industry might be thinking, okay, why? Why would I invest in Constellation Brands? Constellation Brands actually picked up a 10% stake in 2017 of a company called Canopy Growth. It's traded under the ticker TSX WEED, so they do have the weed ticker, highly coveted, and they're a Canadian producer of recreational cannabis. So further rounds of investment have increased Constellation's brand to above a 35% stake. So they own a pretty large percentage of this company. And it's interesting because we actually really like Canopy Growth's positioning in the market. They are by far the industry leader in terms of production capacity. They have access to international markets, which is huge for this space. And we think it's possible that Canopy Growth will actually turn out to be a long-term leader, but we're not sure if that will actually make it a good investment. They have a really interesting deal with Acreage Holdings, actually, here in the US, that if cannabis is legalized federally in the US, then they can buy out Acreage Holdings, which would really give them a leg up. However, in order to keep sustaining themselves until something like this happens, right, until they're profitable, they're really going through a lot of rounds of shareholder dilution. So they're raising money by issuing more shares. This means that even if you really like Canopy Growth's business, it can actually be a really bad investment for you. Meanwhile, you can buy Constellation Brands not only at a much more reasonable valuation, but Constellation Brands over the same period that Canopy Growth has increased their share count 78%, they've actually decreased theirs 5%. And they have strong, steady cash flow business, they pay dividends, and they have direct exposure. So it's not the most glamorous investment for people who are looking to get into a producer. Maybe it doesn't sound very fun and attractive, but it's actually, in my opinion, a much better buy if you're looking for this Canadian distributor producer exposure, because they have that direct exposure, but they have a strong underlying business to complement it.
All right, a couple of stocks for your watch list. Plus, you can get the free report. Just click the link below, or you can go to fool.com/MJ, and we will email you that report. Let's get to the questions that are pouring in. First from Mr. Carroll, who asks, do any of the cannabis companies pay dividends, and should they be paying dividends? I'd be surprised if any of these startups are doing
Constellation Brands.
Yes.
Constellation Brands pays a great dividend. If you're looking for a dividend play, that's your play. There's really no cannabis players right now that have any sort of free cash flow potential, right? So they're not returning that shareholder value. In fact, the majority of the companies that you'll find in the market today are diluting shareholder value by issuing more shares to raise money. So they're really not giving very much back. I think if you want dividends, like I said, Constellation Brands is a wonderful way to do that.
And I think for a lot of these companies, because they are ramping up production, because they are investing in R&D, really should not be paying dividends for where they're at in terms of their just tenure as a company. That would be much, much longer term, I think.
A couple of people asking, what are your thoughts on some of the penny stocks in the marijuana space? Safe to say we're not fans as a group?
Avoid like the plague. Now the allure of penny stocks, and this is a question I know I get a lot, the allure is there, right? Because the potential to double or triple or quadruple in share price is certainly there. The problem with penny stocks, and this even extends beyond the marijuana space, is that oftentimes these are companies with very limited operating history. There's a ton more risk, right? So it can take, a small tweak from like a headline that gets published to send the share price skyrocketing. And the same holds true when something goes wrong. So I think the risk really to me is double if not triple for a lot of penny stocks. I'd say avoid these. Don't worry so much about the per share price. Look for good businesses. Look at the fundamentals. Look to see, is this a company that is worth investing for the next 3 to 5 years? I can guarantee you if it's a penny stock, 9 out of 10 times it's probably not.
Chris asks, do you see any good marijuana ETF recommendations? An ETF could be a way to instantly diversify. In general, ETFs are a good way to diversify right out of the gate, but it seems like if folks are following the basket approach you talked about, then who needs an ETF?
Yeah, I'd say, for me, I think do a basket, choose a handful of stocks. I believe there is an ETF out there right now under MJ is the symbol, that if you are maybe a little hesitant to go ahead and pull the trigger on a couple of stocks, that could be a way to enter the space and get some exposure.
And I'll just add that a lot of these ETFs are market weighted, which means that they're going to buy the largest companies in disproportionate, or I guess proportionate ways to how large they are in the market. So you'll notice that Cannabis Growth, which you already mentioned, huge, big time producer, they're likely to hold more shares of Cannabis Growth than they are of something like Charlotte's Web. So when Cannabis Growth underperforms, which it has, by the way, when Cannabis Growth underperforms, then it's more likely that that ETF is going to underperform. So I think ETF is a great way. I would recommend buying a marijuana ETF if you want exposure over trying to buy companies like Tilray and Cannabis Growth outright, companies that are really overvalued, have a direct exposure without making a good basket or giving yourself ancillary plays. But I do like the idea of picking a smaller portfolio, let's say 15 stocks, 10 to 15 companies that you really believe in, that you're going to hold over the long term. This is going to have lower churn, probably better quality companies, and you're not going to be sitting there wondering why your ETF has lost 20% because the marijuana industry is down. You understand the companies that you're holding in your portfolio.
You mentioned Tilray. A couple of people asking about what happened with Tilray and what lessons can investors draw from that. It seems like at least one of the lessons is diversify outside of just one single company.
Absolutely. I think Tilray, a very interesting stock to watch. But I think really the big story is just that its valuation has gotten way ahead of its actual prospects. So especially compared to some of the other larger players like Canopy and Aurora, I just think overall this is a company that still has more question marks than it does answers. And for me, it's just not compelling, especially at the valuation it currently is at.
And if you're an investor and you really like Tilray, let's say, and you're interested in getting Tilray exposure, look to other avenues as well, because like Shannon mentioned, this is a company that is really overvalued. The reason why we've seen the giant pullback is because the valuation at no point makes sense for Tilray. So look at ancillary plays. I know a company that we're a big fan of is InWave. InWave actually produces the machines that Tilray uses to dry out their marijuana products. So hey, there's your Tilray exposure. Much better company, much more stable operating history, has some other products which diversify its line, and we think is a better investment.
Megan asks, what do you guys think of marijuana beverage stocks or companies that specialize in edible products?
We haven't seen a market for it yet, which I think personally I'm excited by. I know Shannon tends to be a little bit more hesitant because, like we said, we haven't seen the market for it. But Canada is expected later this year to legalize the production of edibles and cannabis-infused beverages, and we've seen a lot of people start to invest in this space. That being said, the projections for how big of a market this is are very wide. Some people saying, some companies even saying we're much more interested in investing in just the pure recreational product than we are in producing marijuana-based products. Other people, we've seen Anheuser-Busch do these investments, right? They believe that there's a potential for, cannabis-infused beverages over just pure plays. I think personally, I think it's exciting. I think we have a great opportunity to watch how it plays out in Canada too. So we'll know the answer to that later this year.
Yeah, and some companies are even now starting to step back from the beverage conversation only because the regulatory framework is still so murky, particularly here in the US. And so a lot of companies that were kind of jumping at the bit to get into the beverage space are starting to step back just until it becomes more clear. How is this going to be regulated? What does that look like? So for me, I'd want to see the regulatory framework first before I go and pursue specifically the cannabis infused beverage route. It is very interesting, very intriguing. I think from an edibles perspective, Emily mentioned legalization happening in Canada. You already see companies like Organogram that's already starting to invest, I think like 15 million into a production line just for chocolates. So I think the opportunity is there, but I think until we get more clarity, particularly here in the US, about where is that oversight going to come from, how much CBD and how much THC can actually be in that, THC being the psychoactive ingredient for cannabis. Until we get more clarity on that, I would be willing to wait on the sidelines.
Well, you just touched on something that we've gotten a few questions around, and it's, look, for people who are interested in this industry, what should they be watching in terms of maybe not red flags, but green flags, if you will? Should we be looking for FDA approval? Should we be looking for legalization state by state? What are the things that you two watch?
Yeah, so definitely legalization is huge. I mean, that's a huge catalyst. This is where you see companies like Canopy trying to get ahead of the curve and go ahead and cement their U.S. pathway with this acreage holdings deal. So legalization is key. Edible legalization potentially coming in October of this year is key. Another thing that I think investors really need to watch is banking reform. So right now, a lot of these marijuana companies here in the U.S. Basically have to transact in cash. They're paying taxes in cash because it's still illegal on the federal level. And so there's a bill right now, the Safe Banking Act, that is slowly making its way through Congress. But I mean, that could dramatically transform the landscape of the U.S. Basically, it makes sure that banks aren't punished for doing business with these companies. So that, yes, also FDA approvals. We saw GW Pharmaceuticals get their approval last year for Epidiolex for epilepsy. That's huge. So the more that you can see happening on the regulatory front, and I think even when it comes to legalization, I think you're going to see more of like the federal government kind of deferring to states in many ways. The more that you can see the regulatory framework taking shape, the better.
You asks, are there any cannabis brands that are owned by tobacco companies?
We've seen tobacco investing a lot in cannabis, and it's an interesting play for sure. I think personally a lot of our investors are hesitant to go the tobacco route just because the reason why tobacco is investing is because of a dying demand for their own products, right? So versus something like Constellation brand, which has a strong underlying business, right? They have good beer, good wine, good spirits business, and they're investing because they see opportunities. Tobacco brands are investing as a last means of reaching, right, for something that can save their underlying product line. So I think we're going to see continued investment from tobacco into cannabis, but I also think as a result we're probably going to see a growing black market for cannabis, right, as these investments continue to push up the prices.
Yeah, I think Altria Kronos has a partnership. I think that's really interesting, even from a regulatory perspective, again, because you saw how the FDA came down on Juul, which is the e-cigarette in youth. I think that's really going to shape how the FDA and how the federal government deals with CBD and a lot of these edibles too. They have come out and said, we are actually going to try to get ahead of this rather than try to come back around. For those listeners right now, for e-cigarettes, that was, the FDA was like, this is a safer alternative. We think this could work, unfortunately, and got into the hands of youth. So I think there's a lot of hesitation when it comes to cigarette makers in this space just to see what happens long term.
Luis asks, what is the pharmaceutical industry's play in all this? Are they looking to partner up or attack the medical cannabis industry?
Yeah, I'd say right now partner. So until you see legalization happen on the federal level, I think they're kind of taking a step back on the sidelines. Novartis, of course, has partnered with one of the major brands, I think it's Tilray, to start research. I think they will start to dip their toes, but again, it comes down to regulatory clarity and oversight and figuring out what does this look like. I mean, there are over 100 different cannabinoids within the cannabis plant itself. Really, all the focus has been on CBD and THC, but all the others, there is some evidence that the way they interact could potentially, for example, like heighten the effects of certain medications. I think there's an opportunity within the pharmaceutical industry itself to take some of these existing drugs, see if there are some other cannabinoids that can be partnered to potentially make the drug work better. We're still very early on in this.
At the Motley Fool, we like to look not just what is the hot trend right now, we like to look 10, 20, 30 years out. When you look at this industry, do you see that type of timeline?
Without a doubt. And that's actually what makes me so excited to be an analyst on our marijuana service. And I came in with very strong preconceived notions about what it meant to invest in marijuana, and not to, again, throw crypto under the bus, but I thought about it very much in the context of the hype cycle. I was like, this is something that is really overhyped. People are getting invested into it and they're not knowing what they're doing. They're going to lose a lot of money. They're going to lose their shirt, right? And then as I learned about the industry, while there are definitely opportunities for people to lose their shirts, I realized, you know what makes this different than investing in crypto? It's that the underlying demand is there. It's a product with a differentiated structure. So think about beer brands, right? You don't just have one type of beer. There's lots of different types of beer. People have preferences for different types of beer. Craft beers, exactly. And the cannabis industry is exactly the same. And the demand that we're seeing both in Canada, in the US, internationally, recreationally, and medicinally, that to me makes me really excited to invest in this space, especially if you take that long-term approach, because I know 5, 10 years out in the future, demand for cannabis, demand for hemp, CBD, THC, it's not going anywhere.
Totally agree. I, like Emily, was the same. I was a huge skeptic of just the marijuana industry in general. It wasn't until I really started digging into the medicinal properties and the value that's there. I mean, I've heard about it anecdotally, but it really wasn't until GW Pharmaceuticals made it through the approval finish line and I saw the impact that it was having on all these young kids that suffered from epilepsy. So for me, do I think there's a long-term future? Absolutely, and I think we're only getting started.
Well, and this is something that's, it's anecdotal, but I feel like it plays right into this, and I know you're a big NFL fan. But if you're a sports fan and you look at the way professional sports in America, the major sports, I'm thinking primarily of the NFL and the NBA, the way the leagues have essentially backed off of pretty hard stances with respect to marijuana testing, and particularly in the NFL, more players, current and former players, coming out and saying, yeah, actually, this was so much better for me from a pain management standpoint than popping pills.
Exactly, and then you bring up a great point, Chris. I know we've talked about this a little bit, but from the opioid epidemic right now. Right now, I mean, it's killing, I believe, like 40-some people a day. When you factor in heroin, you're talking another 80. So not just from a player standpoint, but just from pain management alone, it's a huge opportunity. I think a lot of these professional leagues are going to have to change their stance and their drug policy when it comes to marijuana, especially as more research comes out to show not only is this helping, but this is also saving lives potentially too.
All right, 2 more questions before we wrap up here. T-Law asks, how does Scott's Miracle Grow factor into this? Do they have enough exposure to really matter? I mean, they're sort of the go-to brand when you're looking at helping plants grow.
So I have a couple thoughts on that. The first being similar to what I said about tobacco. This is a last-ditch effort for Scott's Miracle Grow. Their underlying business was declining, and the marijuana industry for them gave them that last breath of hope. So I prefer other ways to invest in this space. Additionally, I think we're going to see the change in the way that marijuana is cultivated, and I don't think Scott's Miracle Grow is going to be honestly that vital moving forward. So I'm not a huge fan of it as an investment. I think it's gotten a big valuation pump because of the hype, but I think if cannabis doesn't pan out for them, their business was dying in the first place.
All right, last question from Fred, who asks, with all of this talk, should I invest in Cheetos? I think that's, I mean,
load up on Cheetos.
Like, you should invest in Cheetos just because of how much Cheetos I consume. Yeah. I could personally keep that afloat.
Cheetos, part of the Frito-Lay brand, I think.
Yes.
So you're welcome, Pepsi shareholders. All right, Shannon Jones, Emily Flippen, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for watching. Give us a thumbs up. Please subscribe. Please tell your friends. We do these live Q&As every now and then, and we love it when we get questions from you. From everyone here at The Motley Fool, I'm Chris Hill. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.